So to kick off our next session, we're diving headfirst into one of the most important and, let's be honest, most hyped topics in manufacturing today. So we're joined by someone who has not only witnessed the evolution of MES and MOM, Manufacturing Operations Management, systems over the past 4 decades, but helped to shape the entire industry on it. Please welcome Rick Franzosa, former Gartner analyst and veteran of manufacturing technology, who brings a refreshingly grounded and experienced take. His session, No Turning Back, MES MOM Enters the Age of AI. And he's going to explore how AI is transforming more than just the tech stack. It's redefining how we think about people, processes, data, and technology. And if you've ever wondered why your AI initiatives might be stalling despite the tools being in place, this is the one to pay attention to. Let's give a warm welcome to Rick.
Thank you, Jeff. What a great conference. Are we having fun or what? I want to give a shout out to Jeff Winter because what I've noticed throughout this, I've been to many conferences where it's about a 30-second introduction and typically reading someone's biography. But every single one, at the beginning of the talk and at the end of the talk, he does a great intro, he does a great summary. So kudos, great job. And I also want to thank my old friend, Francisco, who I have never met in person before this show, but we've talked, I don't know, for a dozen years or so, back in the old days. So, for those of you that don't know me, Rick Franzosa, I am a manufacturing technology research analyst, and, what the heck is that? Well, a research analyst, the main role of a research analyst is to be a skeptic. Look at things objectively. Don't get caught up in the hype. Don't get caught up in the marketing, but be a skeptic. You're not a cheerleader for the vendor. You're not a cheerleader for the marketing. You're not a cheerleader, frankly, for end users. And once you've done this a while, once you've matured, you move beyond skeptic. And you become, as you move on in years, a curmudgeon. For those of you that may not know what the word curmudgeon means, it's the old guy who sits on his porch and says, "Get off my lawn." And so I wear the curmudgeon flag proudly. I finished my full-time role at Gartner in the supply chain operations group covering MES, MOM, as Jeff mentioned. I was the original author of Gartner's first and only Magic Quadrant for Manufacturing Execution Systems back in 2016, and in 2024 I killed it off. I want to say that one of the most controversial Magic Quadrants was the year that I added critical manufacturing to the list. Not only because they were on the list, but because they were a leader in their first year. Not only were they a leader in their first year on the scale of vision, completeness of vision, they were the farthest to the right. And I had established vendors coming to me and say, "You can't do that. They start in the lower left. That's where brand new vendors start." And I said, well, first of all, they're not brand new. And second of all, they are doing things at the data level that none of you have even thought of and that I've never seen anywhere else. And that pretty much shut everybody up. So I finished. I retired last April, but I'm back. I recently joined Tech Clarity. 2 good friends there, Jim Brown and Julie Fraser, but honestly, the main reason is, how could I walk away from this topic, MES and AI? Because the curmudgeon in me just loves the fact that this most wonderful groundbreaking, earth-shattering technology that everyone talks about, the first word is artificial. Not real, artificial. So, as I was prepping for this presentation, my wife emailed me several articles, and quite frankly, she's a much better researcher than I am. The first one comes from the New York Times, May 25th, and this story was very interesting because what the coders at Amazon were complaining about is they don't really code anymore. Their job now is to review code that's coming out of Gen AI. And what the article talked about is they have to work faster, it's not as rewarding, it's all changed. But if you can find this article, get a hold of it on the New York Times, the comments that came back, especially from some of the people at Amazon, were very interesting. They're saying, look, the code is dumber. And when it's a challenging coding task, it goes off the rails. But the worst part about it is I'm QAing somebody else's work. And for any of you who have been coders or are coders, and I was way back when, it's relatively easy to look at your own code and debug it and figure out where problems are. But to take something that somebody else wrote, that's a lot tougher, and it's not very rewarding. So the biggest issue not only is the fact that they're just doing QA, the biggest issue is the fact that they're not being creative. They're not using their intelligence. They're not using their ingenuity. And there's a danger in that. And the problem is, Gen AI is not ready, and neither are you, by the way. So, as a former Gartner analyst, I felt I had to use some Gartner content, and I thought that would be really difficult because when you leave this earth, you can't take it with you when you leave Gartner. However, software companies buy the rights to publish Gartner work, and Gartner salespeople seem to love to just throw it up on LinkedIn. So I have this wonderful hype cycle. For those of you who have never seen a Gartner hype cycle, I'm not going to go a long time on this because the day is short. So the thing to notice about this is that a hype cycle has a specific shape. You start out with what they call an innovation trigger, and you go up to the top to the peak of inflated expectations. The key word there being inflated, which is where you believe, because you're being told by the press, by analysts, not analysts, what am I saying? Consultants, vendors, that this is the greatest thing and you got to get on it right away. Then you start to slide down to what's called the trough of disillusionment, where after pilot after pilot after pilot, you suddenly realize it doesn't do everything, which brings you up the slope of enlightenment, where you realize what's good versus what's bad, you focus on what's good, and you get to the plateau of productivity, which means that more than 50% of organizations are using it in full scale all the time. So, what sticks out to me on this? There's a couple of things. First one, real obvious, there's nothing to the right of the peak. Nothing. And so that says it's not ready. But look again. You notice there's a color code. There are 4 white dots up there. I took the time for you, I counted. There's 4 white dots out of the 24. And what those 4 white dots signify is those technologies are expected to be all the way to the other end in less than 2 years. On top of that, there's 10 light blue dots. And what that says is those technologies are expected to be all the way to the other end in less than 5 years. Now, you might say, well, that's some analyst. I says, no, it's not. Each of those dots is a separate document, which Gartner calls an innovation profile, and it's written by a team of analysts. So you could have, for those 24 dots, maybe 40 analysts who are involved with this. So what this says very, very plainly is it's not ready, but it's getting there fast, which I think we heard from both Francisco and from Walker yesterday. And the other thing I thought of right after Francisco talked about, and I just learned this, yesterday on LinkedIn, the next version of, not this hype cycle, but the hype cycle for all of AI was published by Gartner. So this one says, as of September 2023, this one, whoops, I went too far. I didn't go too far, it's not there. That's okay. I will describe it to you. The new one actually has some blue dots on the slope of enlightenment. But the new one is AI, not Gen AI. And so the other thing about the new one is that there's just a dot for Gen AI. And it is right in the middle of that slope on the way down. So proof, it's moving really fast. So, how do we manage this? Well, there were 4 keys to successful adoption of anything. The first is people. Even the most zealous advocates of AI have said that it will be decades before there is a reduced reliance on people. And so, in this world of AI-assisted manufacturing, people need to make a hard look at process. Same old, right? You've seen this before. And what comes after process? Not what you think, data. People have said people process technology for a long, long time, but what we're learning with AI is data is where the importance is. And so there's no scarcity of data, but only people focused on process can determine what data is real, relevant, accurate, etc. And then that's where technology comes in to help you make those decisions. It's people, process, data, technology in that order and with that emphasis. So let's move on to our agenda. There are man-made barriers to AI. And what you should focus on, in a hype-free manner, is a path forward that combines the best with technology and what humans have to offer. My promise to you is that at the end of this session, we'll be able to discuss how technology will help with process, how learning the data, what data is important, will help build the process, and how that will help turn your people into more qualified, more competent, and better frontline workers by leveraging that information. And so, thankfully, I'm able to bring some research from another source because I now work for Tech Clarity. This first slide I'm going to show you about being human is from the Executive Strategies for Sustainable Business Success Survey of 2024 that was authored by Jim Brown. And what business factor drives company success? Workforce development. It's twice as important as digital transformation. It's 4 times as critical as short-term profits. And how are we doing? Well, let's take a look at the risk and disruption. Look at the largest negative business impacts over the last years. Workforce issues. Not so good. So what are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about more than global health, more than financial markets, more than supply chain disruption. What we're talking about is people get in their own way. The first example is something called psychological reactance. This came from a podcast I listened to called Hidden Brain, and it was a gentleman, Dr. Ben Rosenberg from Dominican University of California. And here's the description of psychological reactance. It's the tendency to rebel when your autonomy or freedom are being challenged. It hits you when you hear certain language being used, when someone's trying to persuade you of something. And that can cause a personal investment in the issue, which doubles on the reactance. And how do you react? Well, you might make some poor decisions. There might be aggression. There might be decisions that you make that are poor decisions, but they reassert your autonomy and your freedom. So anybody think of an example in, let's say, the last 5 years of psychological reactance? Just shout it out, anybody. How about a pandemic? When the language that could have been used is, hey, we need to work together. You know, there are things we can do. There's social distancing. There's masking. We're working on a vaccine. We need to work together. Instead, in a lot of places, the language was, you must socially distance. You must put a mask on, and you must take the vaccine. And what does some portion of the population come back with? You're not the boss of me. It happens. That is a common psychological approach when somebody says, you have to do this because I say so. And I'm not saying who's right, who's wrong. It's the way it goes. So what has that got to do with manufacturing? Most people working in manufacturing have zero idea how AI is going to affect their jobs. So we can look at another survey. This is called Making Manufacturing Analytics and AI Matter. This was authored by Julie Fraser, and I think it's a 2025 survey. And one of the questions was, what are the barriers to AI in manufacturing? Look at number 2. Cultural resistance, lack of trust. The only one that's worse is data for the model. So, this reminds me of a gentleman I used to advise when I was at Gartner, and honestly, I felt often that I was his psychiatrist rather than his research analyst. Because he would come to me with these problems. He said, look, we have 5 plants. One of them is using the MES very effectively. I can't get the others to budge. And I said, well, what have you done? He said, well, I went to that plant, and I started talking to the frontline workers. I said, great. And what did you tell them? How did you convince them? I told them it was good for the company. Now, I don't know about any of you, but I was a frontline worker once, and a software developer, and an analyst. And through all of those points of my career, when someone said to me, this is good for the company, the first thing that came to my mind was, probably not good for me. People, what are you going to do? So, the key takeaway, humans are subject to these behaviors, psychological reactants, cognitive entrenchment, which we'll talk about next. It's how we were taught. It's how we define ourselves. And, from the cartoon series Pogo, we have met the enemy, and they are us. So let's move on to process. I'm assuming that we can work to reduce psychological reactants and the lack of trust and cultural issues. The next thing to tackle is process. And the process is where we encounter what we call cognitive entrenchment. I had dozens of anecdotes about cognitive entrenchment, but I'll just use one. And this one is represented by a poster. And this poster was on the wall of the office of my first boss's boss when I joined Pratt & Whitney Aircraft in the mid-'70s. And this is the poster. He put it up, and honestly, I found it on Etsy. It didn't take, I went, oh my gosh, there it is. That poster was his way of saying, hey, we got to rethink. We got to unlearn. We got to do things differently. But when push came to shove, that was the first thing out of his mouth. So how do top performers prepare to tackle process improvement? I learned about a thing called collective intelligence. And it's interesting because collective intelligence, artificial intelligence, they really sort of go together. I will tell you, I am not an expert in collective intelligence. But what I've learned, there are 3 things to focus on. One is diversity of expertise. And this is kind of what Walker was getting at yesterday. You need a group with wide-ranging skills, with wide-ranging backgrounds, with unique experiences, because they can often solve problems better than a group where everybody thinks the same. Secondly, decentralization. You want to put decision-making across the group, not one leader somewhere. And the third, aggregation of information. Collective intelligence relies on the ability to aggregate and synthesize information from various sources, often aided by technology, like large language models, right? Technology can help, but it's not the answer. The value comes out of the dance across functions, across behavior, culture. So, what are some examples? The old days, right? Brainstorming, strategic planning, problem solving. Scientific collaborations spanning large organizations in different countries and disciplines. I'm going to read a little something here because there's a lot of numbers in it. So there was something called the Michael J. Fox Parkinson's Progressive Markers Initiative, PPMI, and they've identified biomarkers associated with Parkinson's disease. 3,000 or more clinics supported at 51 sites, 42,000 online participants, more than 25 million downloads of PPMI research, 40 clinical trials performed, 1,200 scientific publications that have published PPMI information, and almost 40 industry partners providing funding support. That's power. That's the power of collective intelligence. And you take that and you apply it to something that can then do that data mapping and data mining. That's a powerful thing. And of course, the last bullet, things like Wikipedia, open software. Like everything else, there are challenges that can blunt collective intelligence, like information overload. Nobody likes, asking someone to do master data management or data cleansing is like asking a 4-year-old to eat their vegetables. It's just not fun. But in these sorts of situations, just trying to stay ahead, there's going to be a situation where you want to throw out an anomaly, but an anomaly could be the next day's plant shutdown. Groupthink, herd mentality, being talked out of something, right? My favorite, the one loud voice, usually male, but not always. And what fixing this requires is a balance of courage and dedication from people who are ordinarily quiet, and humility and empathy from people who are usually loud. And finally, my favorite, as a curmudgeon, the one thing I hate more than the phrase "one source of the truth" is shop floor to top floor. Drives me crazy. Because there isn't one source of the truth. There are biases. There's organizational bias. There's vendor bias. There's political bias. There's, you name it. And so we must remain vigilant, hyper-focused on rethinking and unlearning, and never falling back on, but we've always done it this way. I forgot my anecdote. This is a great anecdote. I shouldn't leave it out. I used to go to this gym, and they had a dozen treadmills. In front of the treadmills, they had, half a dozen or so flat-screen TVs. And sometimes I'd find myself positioned on a treadmill, and on this side of me was a right-wing morning news show. And on this side, it was a left-wing morning news show, and both with closed caption. If there was a big story going on, I could just go back and forth with those closed captions, and I will tell you, about 30% of the time they were saying the same thing. The other 70% I knew was BS. The 30% was the truth. So you got to be careful. So, that slide was taken out last night, so that's why I went over it. It's all about process. Diverse opinions coming from shared experience and unique experience, as Walker said yesterday. Technology can help, but the real value comes from the dance across functions, across behavior, across culture. So we've covered people, process. Now let's jump into the data swamp. In order for people to work together in continuous improvement projects, like MES, Gen AI, they need data. But what happens when this is your data strategy? Not much. So how do we manage data efficiently? So this slide, and this comes out of another survey called Manufacturing in the Age of AI. It shows the top, consistent data management, closing the loop, data to action. But if you look, the first 6 things are like 4 percentage points apart. But then we took this slide And we said, what do top performers do? And we come up with this one. Top performers are consistently managing all plant data and integration of equipment and plant to enterprise systems. Those are the two most important things. 20% more than everybody else. And close behind with a 10% higher score is putting OT data in context of plant IT data. So data, that's what's important. Data and analytics provide the backbone for improvement and growth. All right, so finally, now we can get on to technology. So one of the things I was able to do as a Gartner analyst is, a set of the, you talk to end users, you talk to vendors. We also got to talk to investors. And those calls were always great because all they cared about was the money and the opportunity. And they were talking to analysts like me to understand the market. But they would typically come in, especially the young marketing people. And of course, at my age, everyone's young. But they would say things like, when we have blank, the silos will disappear. And it started with ERP, PLM, MES, and it moved on. IoT, digital twins, and on and on and on. And now finally, we get to the situation where the thing is now artificial intelligence. I can't help but be a little bit skeptical because it never ends. But let me tell you about silos. People are defined by their silos. It's the department they work in, the group they work with. They feel safe and secure in their silos. Their friends are in their silos. They love their silos. And so breaking down the silos is not a technology issue because there's hard work required. It's not an easy task. I hate to be bringing you down. I'm going to come back up, really, and very soon. A couple of years ago, I was able to become one of 4 people that would moderate Smart Manufacturing Community Group calls for MESI International. And the one I was doing was for, obviously, manufacturing operations software. The very first call I took was on the topic, and this is April 2022, is AI ready for prime time? Spoiler alert, it wasn't. But the audience is typically 40 to 50 people. There are some that are vendors, academia, consultants, analysts, end users. It's a pretty diverse group. The thing that was so interesting about this is the vendors were so frustrated. And why were they frustrated? They're going into companies, and these companies are expecting that there's going to be this red button in the sky, and they just touch it, and they learn everything, and all their problems are solved. When in reality, what was happening is the field engineers would come in and say, okay, show us where your data is. And they'd go, the what? They didn't know what data was important. They didn't know what data was accessible. They were stuck. And so what does that do? And what does it look like across adoption levels of applications? I really like this next slide because, first of all, it's the truth. 2025 survey. But basically, what looks like little pencil erasers, the orange on the end, that's the adoption level of Gen AI automation or support in this survey that TechClarity did this year. I've highlighted those two because that's the highest. IoT platforms, APM, CMMS. And it sort of validates one thing that I've thought. I remember going to what was called at the time GE Intelligent Platforms user group, just before they renamed themselves to GE Digital. And their CEO was there talking about how GE locomotives were able to report back to home base and say, hey, we've got this problem, we need maintenance. And that was their IoT. I can't even remember the name of their IoT program after all these years. But what it pointed out, and it was the same thing with PTC ThingWorx and everyone else, was they were onto something. If you collected enough historical information and you did analytics on it, and not very difficult analytics, you could predict when something would break down. And that's extremely valuable. But it's not AI. So what this says to me is, something I said to clients all along, which is, look, we need that next level set of use cases, that next level set of technology to really turn this on. And when I read about agentic AI and I read about some of the other things that are going on, we're really close. We're really close. But still, there's more to be done. There's more to be done. So how good is today's Gen AI? I'm not going to pick on hallucinations everyone else has. First thing, I don't believe it. This is, again, an old slide. What that's supposed to say is the RPA problem, robotic process automation. Gartner reported in their top strategic technology trends for 2025 that the dangers of agentic AI represented by what they called the robotic process automation problem, which is organizations, when RPA came out, they created thousands and thousands of bots, and at this point, they don't remember what those bots do or why they were built. So the idea behind that is not that, then agentic AI is going to have that problem. What it's saying is, if you're not careful, agentic AI will have that problem. The second thing, LLMs don't get better over time, and this has already been discussed. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but this came from a podcast from Dwarkesh Patel, who is a big advocate of AI. And the title of his podcast is, Why I Have Slightly Longer Timelines Than Some of My Guests. He's basically saying, everybody else thinks we're going to get there sooner. I believe we're going to get there, but maybe not as soon. And the winner is, June 4th, Washington Post printed an article. They took the 5 best-known AI tools, Claude from Anthropic, ChatGPT, Copilot, Google's Gemini, Meta AI, and they asked each one of them to summarize a scientific research paper, a novel, a political speech, and a legal contract. And for those who care, Claude came out on top. ChatGPT was right behind, the other 3 left in the dust. What was most interesting to me is the one that came out on top with the highest positive score. The score was 69.9%, which is really close to a failing grade, at least in the U.S. educational system. And then finally, synthetic data. The new oil, it's been called. What concerns this curmudgeon skeptic about synthetic data is it's defined as creating artificial data that mimics statistical properties of real-world data without actually using real-world observations. So you can create a lot more data and make a lot more decisions without actually having any real backup because you're doing it theoretically. On the one hand, it's an exciting breakthrough. On the other hand, you're now moving farther away from reality as more and more decisions are based on simulation. But Rick, you might ask, is there any good news? Sure there is. First of all, this technology is both exciting and flawed. It's coming fast. It's very powerful. But top-performing companies are already getting value by putting in agentic AI and evaluating as they go. They understand the importance of data consistency, data management, data integration with enterprise information. And in supporting of continuous improvement, consensus building, including legal, ethical, and security and technology standards for agentic AI, all to provide the workforce the insight that improves their ability, their competency, and their decision-making. So, how can you follow their lead? Understand what AI can do and what it can't do, and how that, and vice versa. Rethinking and unlearning and breaking through cognitive entrenchment, being hyper vigilant with data access and data security. In the words of a former president, trust but verify. You're already good at what you do. You already know continuous improvement. Use your diverse knowledge, experience, collective intelligence, if you will, and AI as part of your continuous improvement program. At the beginning of this session, I don't think I asked the question, but the question I was going to ask at the beginning of the session is, what's going to win? Is AI going to become the brain of MES? Is MES going to take over for AI? Or neither? And I think you know the answer. The answer is neither. You're the brain. Human creativity, human imagination, human intelligence will drive the future of digital manufacturing, aided by servants like MES, IoT, digital twins, UNS, AI, and whatever comes next. Thank you.
We got time for a couple questions.
I do.
And as you predicted, I bet you can guess what the highest ranked question is. Do I need to ask it?
Nope. The highest survey says the highest ranked question is, why did you kill off the Magic Quadrant for MES? And actually, Jeff answered that earlier today when he said, I can't remember the source, that's okay.
IoT analytics.
Okay, that MES is the most fragmented market in all of industrial manufacturing. When I joined Gartner in 2014, I was asking about the Magic Quadrant. I said, has a Magic Quadrant ever been done for MES? And my colleague and friend of many years, Simon Jacobson, said, you can't do it. It's too fragmented. 2 years later, I was voluntold that we needed an MES Magic Quadrant. And I did my best. But as I'm sure Francisco can tell you, he probably has people in food and beverage and aerospace and defense coming and saying, can you do an MES for us because you're the leader? It just doesn't work. So after a number of years, I finally convinced management that what we did in 2014 and 2015, which was a market guide that had a chart in it that said, if you're in this industry, these are the guys you need to consider. Now we just published a new market guide which replaced the Magic Quadrant. Next question.
All right, we'll go quick for these. Next one is, what is the contribution of agility on collective intelligence?
Oh, that's a good question. I could preface this the way I prefaced that whole section, which is I'm not an expert on collective intelligence. I think the issue there is that when we talk about collective intelligence and we talk about the team and diverse, we're not talking about a team of hundreds. We're still talking about small, agile teams. And I think from that perspective, when you look at agile from a manufacturing standpoint and you look at continuous improvement, which is really what's driving agile as a tool, I think it fits well together.
All right, we'll end with this one. As an analyst for MES, what is your top piece of advice for a company looking to select a new MES vendor?
The top piece of advice in all of this is find, what's the word I'm looking for? Find believable customer references. Certainly you're going to get customer references from the vendor, but search out others. Honestly, what worked really well for Gartner and continues to work really well for Gartner is that we have the vendor view and we have the client view. And as one of my colleagues used to say, no client sets up a call about a vendor to tell you how good they are. The only time we hear from a client about a particular vendor is when they have complaints. So, our job is to sort of synthesize about they can't be that bad, they can't be that good, right? So it's one of those things where you need to do that same thing yourselves. The vendor's going to tell you all the good stuff. You got to dig out. And with social media, that's a heck of a lot easier. Going again to my favorite researcher, when my wife goes to buy something on Amazon, or when I do, she'll say, look at the reviews, look at all the ones. And what I learned really quickly was, if there's a whole lot of ones, but they're all over the lot, then, maybe it's just noise. But if you see the same complaint 5, 10, 15 times, that's a problem. So you really need to do the same sort of thing.
Awesome. With that, thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.